Namaste, and welcome to our continuing series on the life divine with our beloved Ranga. We are in the chapter, The Origin of the Ignorance, and we are on page 592, beginning with the sentence, "But here a question may arise."
The subject is, how did ignorance come into that which is one single reality, Satchidananda? So if Satchidananda is the perfect, how did this imperfection of ignorance come in? And in the previous chapter, he has described the boundaries of the ignorance. The inconscient, the intraconscient, the superconscient. He has not yet discussed, he will come later on. And now we are saying the origin. Where is the beginning of ignorance? So, I'll read the summary of the previous paragraph so that we have a sense of continuity. He has been discussing, and he has also made reference to many theories like Buddhism and Mayavada, which say that the ultimate reality is a shunyam, a zero, a nothing, okay? A void. So Sri Aurobindo says that I can understand a void which is not really a void. It's a void which is full of all potentialities. But if you say that this void is really a nothing, I can't accept, because a void will produce only chaos, and by chance things will come out. So anything is possible. But we see in the physical world that there is an order, there is a very clear sequence of things, there are laws. So it can't be that the ultimate reality is a nothing. It has to be something. So what is that something? It is, that's what we are going to read the summary now. Okay, that's what he said. This something, not a non-existence, nothing or a nihil, it is not, is Satchidananda, which the Upanishads insist on throughout, and we have also been repeating this. This Satchidananda is an ultimate reality which is threefold, actually one only, but with three aspects: existence, which is subtle substance, consciousness force, and bliss. Our examination of the phenomena of ignorance has led us to consciousness, and that in turn is now leading us to force. So we have to now start examining force. Shakti, because manifestation is a product of consciousness deploying its force to create the world. We have been scrutinizing consciousness in all its aspects from chapter 5, okay, page 428 to now we are on 596. All aspects of consciousness we have discussed. We have then to look at force which creates the universe. But how does the force create the universe? It happens by tapas, concentration of its chit shakti to effectuate its own will. In our normal condition, it will be called concentration. To understand anything or to invent anything, you have to pay full attention to it and concentrate on something. Concentration is a compression and an exclusion of all unnecessary thinking and concentrating only on one thing. So this produces heat. Okay. So, but what is tapas? It is heat. Not to be, it should not be confused, tapas should not be confused with penance.
Yes, we discussed that. Yes.
Normally the idea of tapasya means you are mortifying yourself. There is mortification, but it's not that at all. Okay? It is not penance, which is nothing but bodily torture, mortification, as is often interpreted. In fact, in India, the idea of subjecting the body to pressure of mortification was not current in yogic practices. In other practices, in normal, general idea in the public, yes, but not in yogic practices. The image of the egg was used in the ancient Indian scriptures, Brahmanda. The egg is hatched by heat and the bird, the Purusha, emerges. It's a soul in nature. Okay, so if we examine our own consciousness, we see that consciousness force applies itself in two ways, inwardly on itself and outwardly on others, the world, animate and inanimate. But to Satchidananda, this double action does not apply, as there is nothing outside itself. We have begun with the idea of Advaita. Only the one is the reality, ultimate reality is one. So there can be nothing outside it. So at our level, concentration inwards and concentration outwards, but there nothing is inward and outward, everything is inward only. Everything is included there. There is another difference between the human consciousness and the Satchidananda. In our case, we see that voluntary action is only a small part of the total energy spent on the individual being. The rest is involuntary, subconscious and also superconscious. This fact has great consequences of practical importance in Satchidananda. In Satchidananda, there is only voluntary action. Everything the divine does is by his own will. It is not something that you have to struggle, or in our case, voluntary action is very limited. Most of it is involuntary. When you have cramps, it's not voluntary, it's involuntary. When you have to eat, it is not by your will that you are becoming hungry. You get hungry. So everything is involuntary. When you want to sleep, it is involuntary. It is being forced on you. It's not your voluntary action. So that's the difference between Satchidananda and the human being. The human being has an inside and outside. There is no inside outside. And here there is voluntary and involuntary, mostly involuntary. Okay. Sleepwalking is another example of involuntary action. Okay. So there's everything is done by the divine will. So these are the differences. Now we read the next para that we have to read today. But here a question may arise. Since there is a passivity in existence and in nature as well as an activity, immobile status as well as kinesis, what is the place and role of this force, this power, and its concentration in regard to a status where there is no play of energy, where all is immobile? In ourselves, we habitually associate our tapas, our conscious force, with active consciousness, with energy in play and in internal or external act and motion. That which is passive in us produces no action, or only an involuntary or mechanical action, and we do not associate it with our will or conscious force. Still, since there too there is the possibility of action or the emergence of an automatic activity, it must have at least a passively responsive or automatic conscious force in it. Or there is in it either a secretly positive or a negative and inverse tapas. It may also be that there is a larger conscious force, power or will in our being, unknown to us, which is behind this involuntary action. If not a will, at least a force of some kind, which itself initiates an action or else responds to the contacts, suggestions, stimulations of the universal energy. In nature also, we know that things stable, inert or passive, are yet maintained in their energy by secret and unceasing motion, and energy in action upholding the apparent immobility. Here too then, all is due to the presence of Shakti, to the action of its power in concentration, its tapas. But beyond this relative aspect of status and kinesis, we find that we have the power to arrive at what seems to us an absolute passivity or immobility of our consciousness, in which we cease from all mental and physical activity. There seem then to be an active consciousness in which consciousness works as an energy, throwing up knowledge and activity out of itself, and of which therefore tapas is the character, and a passive consciousness in which consciousness does not act as an energy but only exists as a status, and of which therefore absence of tapas or force in action is the character. It is the no. Is the apparent absence of tapas in this state real, or is there such an effective distinction in Satchidananda? It is affirmed that there is a dual status of Brahman, quiescent and creative, is indeed one of the most important and fruitful distinctions in Indian philosophy. It is besides a fact of spiritual experience. So, what he is saying is that in the physical world, we see that there are two forces. There is a passivity and a activity. It's very obvious. If I keep quiet, I am not speaking, there is passivity, relative passivity. And when I am speaking, then there is activity. The same, if I am lying down without movement, passivity. But in fact, Srimad is saying that everything that seems to be passive in the physical world is actually in movement. The stone seems to be passive, but at the atomic level, there is movement. So there is movement and activity and non-activity, both are there in the physical world. Yes. So is this also there in the upper layers? So he's saying that we know by spiritual experience that we can go from activity, our consciousness can go to the self, where it becomes absolutely static. Your consciousness becomes static, immutable, and the activity is there, the action is there but held back, like the water behind the dam.
So Satchidananda can have both.
Yes, it is both. There is both. So I read the summary of this one. Okay, I have given the gist of what we have discussed, but we will see the gist. Now I am reading the same thing in my own words, simpler words, so that we understand what he is saying. Now a question arises. In existence, which is the subtlest of substance, and also in nature. So existence is the highest sat, the subtlest of substance, and nature is the grossest of substance. You can say spirit and matter. Okay? So there is also in nature, there is a passivity as well as an activity, a static condition and dynamism. Since we are looking at force, we may ask, what is force doing in these states? Where is the force in passivity? Where is the force in activity? We can ask. Okay? In one, it's a creative movement. In the other, it is resting without movement. In the stone, it is resting. Force is there, but it is resting without movement. You may say that I don't see the force in a stone. But if you go to the atomic level, we know that there is force there. We have been able to tap that. Atomic energy, now we know how to tap. So there is force there in the stone also. And also in nature's passivity activity. Since we are looking at force, we may ask, what is force doing in these states? In one, it's a creative movement. It's creating action. Action is creating something. When I am speaking, the words are creating an influence and people can understand what is being said. Okay, so there is a creation. In movement, there is creation. In non-movement, it is resting without movement. Passivity and activity are both states of Shakti. Tapas is in action or at rest. Tapas is the heat producing, concentration. When we look into ourselves, all our actions we associate with force in movement, whether objective in the external world or psychologically subjective. The force mobile in us produces action. The force at rest does not end in action, it is immobile. But force at rest may be producing action which is involuntary. Okay? So, for instance, heartbeats, blood circulation, sleepwalking, involuntary bodily movements. There are many people who have that habits of twitching, things like that. Involuntary. So that's what Srimad is pointing out, okay? So, but force at rest may be producing action which is involuntary, okay? Physical, mechanical habits. Could these involuntary movements be originating from a passive force or perhaps a negative tapas, he is asking. So if it is involuntary, what is the role of force in it? Okay? He is asking, could these involuntary movements be originating from a passive force or perhaps a negative tapas? Interesting word of using, negative tapas. Okay? In fact, science has the concept of antimatter. Okay? So matter and antimatter. Okay? Or again, could it be that a universal force is causing all movements in the individual being, including mind, life and body? What are the possibilities? He is looking at it. He is examining force. He has told us that we are going to examine force. So where is force coming from, even when there is passivity? That's what he is asking. Okay? So we see also that in nature, all that seems stable and static is actually maintained in existence by an unceasing movement. That we know. At the atomic level, there is constant movement. Okay, so matter and atomic whirlings. Then there is also the individual consciousness that can enter a state where all action, mental, vital and physical, ceases completely. He is talking about the self, the Brahmic consciousness. You go to the self, immutability. Thought is not there, no action is there, it is static. Okay. The witness consciousness. There is then a movement of tapas, creative energy, throwing up knowledge and activity out of itself, and another, a static poise of force where tapas seems to be passive. Does all this correspond to anything real in Satchidananda? In Satchidananda, is there also force and passivity and activity? Spiritual experience confirms the dual status of the Brahman, static and dynamic, saguna and nirguna. And you can experience saguna and nirguna separately, and you can also experience them together. That also is possible. In the supramental level, the world is real to you, and that also, spirit and matter, both are real to you. This is what he said in the para. We go to the next para?
Yes.
Here, let us observe first that by this passivity in ourselves, we arrive from particular and broken knowledge at a greater, a one and a unifying knowledge. We will come back to it. Secondly, that if in the state of passivity we open ourselves entirely to what is beyond, we can become aware of a power acting upon us which we feel to be not our own in the limited egoistic sense, but universal or transcendental, and that this power works through us for a greater play of knowledge, a greater play of energy, action and result, which also we feel to be not our own, but that of the divine, of Satchidananda, ourselves only its field or channel. The result happens in both cases because our individual consciousness rests from an ignorant limited action and opens itself to the supreme status or to the supreme action. In the latter, the more dynamic opening, there is power and play of knowledge and action, and that is tapas. But in the former, also, in the static consciousness, there is evidently a power for knowledge and a concentration of knowledge, or at least a concentration of consciousness in immobility and a self-realization, and that too is tapas. Therefore, it would seem that tapas, concentration of power of consciousness, is a character of both the passive and the active consciousness of Brahman, and that our own passivity also is a certain character of an unseen supporting or instrumentalizing tapas. It is a concentration of energy of consciousness that sustains, while it lasts, all creation, all action and kinesis. But it is also a concentration of power of consciousness that supports inwardly or informs all status, even the most immobile passivity, even an infinite stillness or an eternal silence. Now, one can give very interesting examples. I'll read the summary of this one, what we have read just now. But in the physical world also, status and dynamis, both are always together, always. One very good example is the clock. Take the second hand. Action, rest, action, rest, action, rest, action, rest, action. You see, that's one example. And also in many others, okay? When you are looking at a cinema, okay, you see a continuous image. That we have discussed also, I have to repeat again. We are seeing a continuous image. There is no static condition, it's all movement. Actually, is it so? No. Because the continuous movement is made by 1 second of action is in 24 frames. The film that is there, 24 frames makes one action. So what do you have? You have 1 frame, 2 frames, 3, 4. So you have a continuous action is actually a collection of static movement, static movement, static movement, static movement. And this is true even at the universal level. The world is being created every instant and being destroyed. In other words, rest and action, rest and action. You feel that everything is continuous in the physical world, but in actual fact, the Brahma is creating, Shiva is destroying instantaneously, and Vishnu is preserving. So, this is a side effect of what Krishna is saying here, that movement and static are there everywhere together. Consciousness force is one element, not two.
We see it in nature very clearly. In nature.
Yes, that's right.
Always.
That's what he's saying. So, even in infinite stillness or an eternal, there is, all the two are always together. I read the summary of what he's saying here. This passivity of our own inner consciousness has two results. He is talking of the spiritual experience of the self. You can't be passive here in this physical world. Your consciousness can be passive only there, in the self, above the body-mind life. Okay, so this passivity in our own consciousness has two results. First, from a fissured, divided, partial knowledge, we graduate to a greater level, tending towards oneness, unity. So, in the physical world, I am seeing multiplicity. I am seeing you different, you different, you different, everybody is different. But actually there is a oneness, which I don't see here. But when I go to the self, I see the oneness. Okay? So that's one difference. Okay, so. Secondly, if in this passivity we open ourselves upward to a larger, wider consciousness above ourselves, we find that a universal power acts on and through us. And this cosmic force is not felt by us to be our own, but that of the divine. This greater force opens us to an even greater knowledge and more potent energy. So even in the self, what is static, there is a force that is acting on you and that gives you greater knowledge. There also, there is movement and status, both. In both cases, knowledge status or action, we go from a narrow, small state of ignorance and limited action to a supreme status and supreme activity. Okay? So, in the action, there is concentration of energy, which we call tapas. But we find that even in the passivity and tranquility of the self, there is this tapas, but sort of held back in silence. The example is that of the water behind the dam. The water seems to be static, but it's full of force. The moment you let it come out of the dam, it comes out with great force. The force is there, but held back. That's what he's saying. Okay? So, this tapas is present in both cases, passivity as well as activity. So it is tapas that is there in all the activity of the cosmos. It is this silence that supports and makes possible all the action in the universe. Even science had a problem with this. Okay? Is the time movement, is it a series of particles, or is it like a wave, a continuous wave? Is there continuity or is there a break? So they could not decide, okay? And they decided to call it particle. No, wait, what is it? Particle, wavicle. They called it a wavicle in science. The same problem arose. Is there a continuity or is there only particles? Activity, passivity, activity, passivity, activity, passivity. So even science had the problem, but they have not understood that both exist at the same time. Okay, so so we may say that in the activity of the world, there is, supporting it from behind, this passivity of the self. And in the passivity, immutability, too, there is this tapas, concentrated energy of the consciousness. In other words, movement is not possible without a background of static condition. It is the silence that allows the movement to take place. That's what he said in the para. We go to the next?
Yes, we have time.
But still, it may be said, these are in the end two different things, and this is shown by their difference of opposite results. For a resort to the passivity of Brahman leads to the cessation of this existence, and a resort to the active Brahman leads to its continuance. So when you go to the self, the world ceases for you. That's a spiritual experience. So, and if you are in the physical world, then there is a continuance of action. So they are opposite. We can't say that they are all together. That's what is being questioned. The question is being asked. Okay. For a resort to the passivity of Brahman leads to the cessation of this existence, and a resort to the active Brahman leads to its continuance. But here too, let us observe that this distinction arises by a movement of the individual soul from one poise to another, from the poise of Brahman consciousness in the world, where it's a fulcrum for the universal action, to or towards the poise of Brahman consciousness beyond the world, where it's a power for the withholding of energy from the universal action. Moreover, if it is by energy of tapas that the dispensing of force of being in the world action is accomplished, it is equally by the energy of tapas that the drawing back of that force of being is accomplished. Okay? This passive consciousness of Brahman and its active consciousness are not two different things. They are not two different, conflicting and incompatible things. They are the same consciousness, the same energy, at one end in a state of self-reservation, and at the other casting into a motion of self-giving, self-deploying, like the stillness of a reservoir and the coursing of the channels which flow from it. Srimad has given the example himself, the dam, the water behind the dam. See? The stillness of a reservoir and the coursing of the channels which flow from it. In fact, behind every activity there is and must be a passive power of being from which it arises, by which it is supported, which even we see in the end governs it from behind without being totally identified with it, in the sense of being, in the sense of at least of being itself. All, what is that word?
Poured out.
Poured out into the action and indistinguishable from such a self-exhausting indistinguishable from it. Such a self-exhausting identification is impossible. So, there is from the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, it is there, and we will repeat that after the paragraph. Okay. Self-exhausting identification is impossible. He is saying from the silence, movement is coming out. Does it get exhausted? He is asking. It never gets exhausted. Okay, so that's the thing. For no such action, however vast, exhausts the original power from which it proceeds, leaving nothing behind it in reserve. When we get back into our own conscious being, when we stand back from our own action and see how it is done, we discover that it is our whole being which stands behind any particular act or sum of activities, passive in the rest of its integrality, active in its limited dispensation of energy. But that passivity is not an incapable inertia, it's a poise of self-reserved energy. A similar truth must apply still more completely to the conscious being of the infinite, whose power in silence of status as in creation must also be infinite. So what we have that famous mantra, okay, so Purnamada Purnamidam Purnat Purnam Udachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnameva Avashishyate. What it means is, spirit is infinite and the manifestation is infinite. The infinite arises from the infinite. Subtract the infinite from the infinite, the remainder is the infinite. So in other words, the silence is inexhaustible. Spirit is not limited, it is infinite. You can go on drawing all the energy out of it, it will remain exactly. It's not like a water tank which exhausts itself. So this is what Srimad is saying. Both are there all the time. And action is not something different from inaction. It can pull itself in, then it becomes static. It can go into movement, and that is movement. This has been discussed much earlier in the chapter Conscious Force. He has discussed this in full detail there. Okay? So here he is referring to it because he is trying to find out what is force and consciousness, and he is trying to find the origin of ignorance. Where is ignorance coming from? Okay? So, I read the summary now of this, what we read just now. Okay. Yet it may be said that the silence and the dynamics are two contrary principles, since their results lead to diametrically opposite directions. Passivity denies reality of the world and moves away from it as an illusion. This is the spiritual experience of the self. When you make your mind silent, you go to the self which is the only truth, and the rest, the world, seems to be an illusion. So that is the result of passivity. Then activity continues, meaningful action in the real world. The two are different. So are they not different? That's what he is going to discuss now. But we see that both movements start from the individual consciousness of the soul. The individual is the agent through whom the cosmic force acts in the world, whether for action or inaction. So we find that action or inaction are not different things. It's the same force, once withholding itself, and again the same force deploying itself into extending self-expression. The water behind the dam is a good illustration. Okay? It is from silence that the dynamism is born. Also to be noted is the fact that both are infinite, and silence can never exhaust itself by spending its energy outwards. The Brihadaranyaka mantra, which we have just now read. Okay? So, we also find that when we act, engage ourselves in a limited, specific work, it is the totality of our energy which, standing at the back, supports the limited action, which would not have been possible without that infinite support of consciousness, force and ananda. That is the reason why you can have experience of both. You can have the experience of the nirguna. The nirguna means the passive, absolute featurelessness, static condition. And you can also have the experience of saguna, the infinite multiplicity of the world, but the divine is there in this multiplicity. Both are possible. It is immaterial for the moment to enquire whether the passivity out of which all emerges is absolute or only relative to the observable action from which it holds back. So, it is enough to note that though we make the distinction for the convenience of our minds, there is not a passive Brahman and an active Brahman, but one Brahman, an existence which reserves its tapas in what we call passivity and gives itself in what we call its activity. For the purposes of action, there are two poles of one being or a double power necessary for creation. The action proceeds on its own circuit from the reservation and returns to it, presumably the energy that we derived to be again thrown out in a fresh circuit. The passivity of Brahman is tapas, or concentration of its being, dwelling upon itself in a self-absorbed concentration of its immobile energy. The activity of tapas of its being, releasing what it held out of that incubation into mobility and travelling in a million waves of action, dwelling still upon each as it travels and liberating in it the being's truths and potentialities. There too is a concentration of force, but a multiple concentration, which seems to us a diffusion. But it is not really a diffusion, but a deploying. Brahman does not cast its energy out of itself to be lost in some unreal exterior void, but keeps it at work within its being, conserving it unabridged and undiminished in all its continual process of conversion and transmutation. The passivity is a great conservation of Shakti, of tapas, supporting a manifold initiation of movement and transmutation into forms and happenings. The activity is a conservation of Shakti, of tapas, in the movement and transmutation. As in ourselves, so in Brahman, both are relative to each other, both simultaneously coexist, pole and pole, in the action of one existence. He is repeating the same thing, that both are always there together. Okay? Again, it's best to read the summary so that we get the idea of what he's saying. We can go through each sentence, but I am giving you the summary of it. Okay? So he is saying, we need not ask at present whether the passivity is relative or absolute to the activity. Okay? So, what is the status of both? Let us note, what he is saying probably is that are activity and silence both coming from one source, or are they fundamentally different forever? Like, for instance, in Sankhya philosophy, okay, the Purusha and Prakriti, they have the theory that they both are fundamental entities. But the Advaita does not believe that. Swami also does not believe. They are both one at the highest level. They seem to be different at the lower level. The one becoming the many. We need not ask at present whether the passivity is relative or absolute to the activity. Let us note that the passivity and the activity are not opposites, nor are they separate. They are both really the Brahman expressing itself on two poles of the one and same being. Passivity is a self dwelling upon itself. The activity is the same force deploying itself into movement. It is tapas in both cases. So, the transcendent is a condition where it is pulling itself in. It is not creating the world. So, that is a passivity, but with force. It is forcing itself into a concentrated condition. That's the transcendent. The world doesn't exist in the transcendent. If you experience the transcendent, the world disappears. Okay? And then it lets out its energy and creates, deploying. That's a movement, and that's a world. So spirit and matter are not different, they are really the same thing. One is in movement, one is static. Okay. The passivity is self-dwelling upon itself. Self-dwelling upon itself. The activity is the same force deploying itself into movement. It's a tapas in both cases. Tapas is the heat of incubation in the activity. It's a multiple concentration into many forms. It looks like a diffusion, a dilution, but it is not really so. It's a deploying of itself into infinite centers. The process is the same in the individual and the universe. And the individual can become the universe, and the universe can condense itself into the individual. That's what he's saying in the para. The reality then, remember, he is discussing force. He has said we have discussed consciousness, now we are discussing force. Okay? This is all the discussion of force. The reality then is neither an eternal passivity of immobile being or an eternal activity of being in movement, nor is it an alternation in time between these two things. Okay? Static, dynamic, static, dynamic, static, dynamic. Is it in time like that? It's asking. Neither in fact is the sole absolute truth of Brahman's reality. Their opposition is only true of it in relation to the activities of his consciousness. When we perceive its deployment of the conscious energy of its being in universal action, we speak of it as the mobile, active Brahman. When we perceive its simultaneous reservation of its conscious energy of its being kept back from the action, we speak of it as the immobile passive Brahman, Saguna, Nirguna, Kshara and Akshara. Otherwise, the terms would have no meaning, for there is one reality and not two independent realities. The Sankhya says there are two independent realities, but not the Advaita. One immobile, the other mobile. In the ordinary view of the soul's evolution into the action, pravritti, and its involution into the passivity, nivritti, it is supposed that in the action, the individual soul becomes ignorant, nascent of its passive, which is supposed to be its true being, and in the passivity, it becomes finally nascent of its active, which is supposed to be its false or only apparent being. But this is because the two movements take place alternately in us, as in our sleep and waking. We pass in waking into nations of our sleeping condition, in sleep into nations of our waking being. But this happens because only part of our being performs this alternative movement, and we falsely think of ourselves as only that partial existence. But we can discover by a deeper psychological experience that the larger being in us is perfectly aware of all that happens, even in what is to our partial and superficial being a state of unconsciousness. It is limited neither by sleep nor by waking. So it is in our relations with Brahman, who is our real and integral being. In the ignorance, we identify ourselves with only a partial consciousness, mental or spiritual mental in its nature, which becomes nascent of its self of status by movement. In this part of us, when we lose the movement, we lose at the same time our hold on our self of action by entering into passivity. By an entire passivity, the mind falls asleep or enters into trance or else is liberated into a spiritual silence. But though it's a liberation from the ignorance of the partial being in its flux of action, it is earned by putting on a luminous nescience of the dynamic reality or a luminous separation from it. The spiritual mental being remains self-absorbed in a silent, essential status of existence and becomes either incapable of active consciousness or repugnant. How do you pronounce the word?
Repugnant, yes.
Repugnant?
Yes.
Okay, the G is pronounced. The G is pronounced here. The G
is pronounced.
Is pronounced here.
Yes, repugnant.
In poignant, it is not pronounced.
Yes, poignant is not sounded.
Okay, consciousness repugnant to all activity. This release of silence is a status through which the soul passes in its journey towards the absolute. But there is a greater fulfillment of our true and integral being, in which both the static and the dynamic sides of ourself are liberated and fulfilled in that which upholds both and is limited neither by action nor by silence. This paragraph we will redo next time in detail, because it will give a very clear picture of what he is saying. There is action here at level 1, there is no action at level 2, but there is action and passivity in level 3. 3 levels: the Kshara, the Akshara, and the Purushottama. Or if you want, matter and the self, the spiritual planes of consciousness, and the supermind, which combines both. We'll redo this, because I have gone very fast through all the other paragraphs.
Yes.
I have only given the summary, because mostly it's repetition. But if we do this in detail, everything will be clear. So next time, we'll redo this.
The reality.
Yeah, the reality time. Then is neither.
Good.
Page 595.
595, yes.
The reality, 595.
Thank you, Ranga. Namaste all. Very enlightening evening. We will meet again on Saturday at the same time, 5:10, 5:15, to continue the origin of the ignorance. Namaste.